Welcome. This is week 8 of our conversations on community resilience in changing times. And welcome to this week's speakers. We have DILLY, Rhiannon and David, who I'll introduce a bit more in a minute. So welcome to the three of you. We were saying that just as we started, this is the first evening it's been light in England at this time of night. So it's nice to have a bit of light for the first time. So the conversation this week is on the theme of faith. And so I will just read a little something to introduce our topic. Faith is defined as great trust or confidence in something or someone. While many of us associate the word faith exclusively with religion, today I hope we can broaden our understanding of and relationship to faith. The conversation today will include an exploration of faith from religious and spiritual traditions, because these are often the places where faith can be most visible. But faith is not exclusive to this. Faith, in my experience, is trusting in something greater than myself and in the sacred within life. For example, I have faith that the sun will rise the next day when I go to sleep at night. I have faith when I turn the tap that water will come. I have faith there'll be food to eat when I go to buy some. And I have faith that when I put my foot down, the ground will be there to meet it. If we think about it, in many ways, we live our lives rooted in faith, whether we're aware of it or not. During this time, how has our faith in the world around us changed? And what do we believe in now? Do we need to rethink our relationship to faith? And what do we really have faith in? The closure of places of worship has had a profound effect on faith and belief communities, as they serve as a space for belonging, support, and community involvement. Reopening places of worship after lockdown has been a major challenge, and so some communities have worked to provide resilient resources to help communities stay connected. I hope today we can hear how our faith may have been strengthened while being tested in these times, and how it might be the glue that has held us together as communities over the last year of the pandemic, as well as providing common ground from which we can forge resilient plans for our future ahead. So, smelly an introduction to faith. And we were just having a little conversation before we started this about actually when I really explored faith, you know, this exploring how actually we do all have faith in some way, and sometimes we can be quite limited around that word and what it means, but as I described in those different examples, we are living in faith every day in some way, which was really interesting to come across that when I really explored what faith was. So I'll now just introduce our speakers and let them talk a little bit more on this topic. So first of all, we have DILLY Baker. Hello, DILLY. Welcome. DILLY is a vicar in North London, one of Church of England's first women to be ordained as a priest. She is passionate about building diverse communities through value-driven alliances. We look forward to hearing more about that. So welcome to the call, DILLY.
Thank you very much. Good to be here.
Okay, great. And next we have David Lake. Hello, David. Give us a little.
Hi.
Hi, David. David has been a member of a Sufi community for over 30 years and lives his quest to bring what he has been given by his tradition in bringing it into daily life for the benefit of all. So welcome, David. Look forward to hearing more about that. Welcome. And lastly, we have Rhiannon Hague. Rhiannon is an interfaith minister, a spiritual counsellor, and sacred voice worker with a love for creating spaces for people from all faith traditions and none to connect with the sacred. So welcome, Rhiannon. Nice to have you with us. So it'd be good to know a bit more about you, really, if you would like to say a little bit more about why you said yes to being on this call today and why you felt it was important to be part of this conversation. David, would you like to go first to answer
Yes,
that?
why not? Yeah. And so out of the blue, Catherine asked me a few weeks ago to get involved, assisting her with this project. and it was just this big yes straight away. My heart just went bang, yes. We've been out of the loop with each other for a couple of years, so it was a real blessing, and it's been really good fun doing this. And then when you asked me to appear on this again, it was just this big yes. I didn't have to think about it. And this hilarious thing happened that before I even had a chance to send you a thumbs up to say yes, the phone sent one anyway. Bigger than the usual one that I had sent. And, oh, okay. And you could say there's no reason. It was just a yes, and that was it. But another way of looking at it was really to say, well, my heart said so. And in our tradition, we're really encouraged to be the child of the moment and to follow our intuition, listen to the signals that life gives us, follow our hearts. And here I am. It's just an opportunity just to show up and share in something wonderful and weave something into the fabric of life. Thank you.
Thanks, David. That's really nice. Dilly, would you like to say a little bit more about yourself and where you're coming from?
Thank you. I guess, well, firstly, I couldn't refuse you, Catherine, could I? So that's why I'm here. Catherine lived with me a few years ago, and it was great fun having you around. I miss you. But why did I say yes? Because I guess you tapped into all my buzzwords, really, things that I believe in. Community has been part of my life for at least the last 30 years. I've lived in 2 communities for some years, brought up my kids in communities to the extent that they thought that was what everyone did and that was the norm, that it's perfectly normal to live with 15 people or 35 people or whatever it was. So community is where my heart is, and I just believe passionately in the strength of communities. Faith has defined me, I guess. Over the 30 years I've been in an official role as a priest in the Church of England, but you know, that sounds a bit stymied, doesn't it? What I mean by that is spirituality, I think, is what motivates me, gets me out of bed in the morning, makes me feel passionate. I'm not so sold on the institution. I can take it or leave it, but spirituality that needs to say yes to life and what brings one joy and challenges one has kept me going over the years, really. Resilience, well, that's something I'm exploring. It's a buzzword at the moment, isn't it, for all the right reasons, how we need to learn the art of resilience. And I'm only just beginning, I think, to unpack what that might mean for me in my faith journey going forward. But thank you for the opportunity to be part of this conversation.
Thank you, Dilly. And yeah, as you mentioned, we lived together. We had the great pleasure of living with you and your family. And I was so struck in the time that I lived with you about how you live your faith in your community, how you really show up for your community. That I was so touched seeing that. So I'm glad you mentioned that. And Rhiannon, who also lives in a community. Yeah, would you like to say a little bit about your take on where you're coming from with this conversation?
Yes, yeah. So Catherine just said that, you know, one bit, anything to do with community. I've been living in an intentional community for the past 17 years. And before that, been living always, you know, with other people or working together, working cooperatively, leading lots of groups. So actually, I become alive in connection with other people. And so that's really interesting for me. And the other part that I am is, you know, spirituality. It's been going right through my life from my very first memories. And, you know, to become an interfaith minister was a logical conclusion of a whole, you know, of all what's gone before. And so one, I can echo what David said. I just set out, actually, these are the things I'm passionate about. How can I get that out into the world? And the next day, this message arrived from Catherine saying, do you want to be part of it? And I went, oh, and I thought, well, okay, because that's how I work. I've asked, for something, and here I'm getting a sign, so I'm showing up for that. And there is a bit that in these times, for me, there is so much, there's a lot of fear around at the moment. There's a lot of disconnection. And I think a connection to each other and a connection to the sacred is really, is an important thing always. And yeah, and that's what I'm interested in, really. And that's for me, is resilience, is really, it's because it's my own inner resilience, is to be connected to that, and working with that. And I'm looking forward to seeing what will emerge today. And thank you so much for inviting me.
You're so welcome. It's not the first time I've heard the synchronicities like that. So it's nice to know that the life is working through us in some way. So I just wanted to mention at this point, we've realised that 3 out of 4 of us at least here are potentially going to be challenged by internet difficulties, because I know Rhiannon was cutting out a little bit there. So we may turn videos off if internet is challenged. If you're listening to the audio, please bear with us. Obviously, we're all still in lockdown and at home and relying on our internet signal at the peak time of the day in England, 6 p.m. So if you do hear it cutting out a bit, just bear with us and we'll do our best to kind of get things back on track. Okay, so I'm going to lead in some conversations so we could just find out a bit more about you, if that's okay. So I will start with DILLY, if that's all right. DILLY, the question I had for you is, let me just scroll down so I can find it. So what I understand of you as a Church of England priest is that you really live in service to your community, as I mentioned. Like I really feel like you live it every day in your life. I really saw that. How has this changed since the pandemic?
Well, I'll try to answer that, Catherine, by speaking, I guess, a bit more about the externals in terms of how that's changed.
Yeah, that's fine.
My faith community, the church I operate from, has as its mission to be a place of hospitality, serving one another, no questions asked, so to speak, and especially those who are most marginal in our community. And that has been our hallmark, if you like, and it's what I guess we're known for. During the pandemic, what's happened is that we've known about the disparities between those who have and those who haven't. It's really shone a spotlight on that, hasn't it? And I think that has become all too evident in my community, where there is huge wealth, but where, for example, the queue for the food bank has trebled. And so what this pandemic has done in terms of community has really dramatically shone a spotlight on the inequalities that there are out there. But secondly, I would say that in my work, I've always been searching for appropriate networks and partners to work with, people who share our values and our approach to life, and be they secular or spiritual. I don't like that differentiation. I think all of life is spiritual, but you know what I mean when I say that. And I've always searched for those connections, but during this pandemic, they have just erupted because people have been looking to bring the very best of who they are out into the community and to serve each other. And that's been kind of delightful to see. in some ways, if I'm honest, a little bit threatening, because here's the church thinking, oh, I thought it was our domain. We thought we were the goodies here. And all of a sudden, all these wonderful partners are emerging, and they haven't all survived. And I think that's got something to do with the process of trauma and what goes on for people and the ways in which we respond to it. But nevertheless, it's phenomenal to see that the wonderful things that are happening in the community for the sake of bringing people together and empowering those who are most marginal. And so I think those would be the two areas that I would say have seen the most significant change in my community.
I'm so pleased to hear that, Dilly. I feel so pleased to hear that. Could you give us an example of one of the sort of marginalised projects that have come out with the more?
Yeah, so we started up something called the Second Chance Cafe, and that's second chance because we're giving a second chance to discarded vegetables from local food outlets. So basically, some of the food outlets down Church Street, they give us their fruit and veg, and volunteers come in and make soups and smoothies. And then we started up this community cafe on a pay-as-you-feel basis. So we have all sorts of different folk from the area. The sad thing is, of course, it had to stop and start a great deal because at the minute we can't have the cafe at all. But it's a lovely example that started from this mission to be hospitable and to offer hospitality to whoever, whenever. And it's just mushroomed into something that has just grabbed the attention of the community. So somebody will come in and they might leave a donation of a tenner for a bowl of soup, and somebody else doesn't feel able to leave anything, and that's absolutely fine, because that's what we're there for, just to serve. And barriers are broken down, and people meet one another people who they wouldn't necessarily talk to in the street or meet at work. But there's a common meeting space and a safe space where people can come together, and that feels really positive. And we've worked with the National Food Services, who came and did some training for some of our volunteers, and they are the most incredible project, who again just work with anyone and everyone to achieve the wonderful objective of feeding people. And what a terrible shock it is that there are so many people who are so hungry in 2021. But that's another story.
Yeah, absolutely. That is another story. But thanks for mentioning that, Dilly. It's a really important topic. So, and great to hear. I love that vegetables get a second chance, not just people. Yeah. That's great. Okay, thanks, Dilly. So, David, I'll move on to your question, if that's all right. David, my question to you is that you've been part of a Sufi tradition for the last 30 years. I was wondering, in your time in that tradition, what have been the key things that you've learned from the tradition that helps you to bring a sense of adaptability to these current times?
So the image that comes to mind of the tradition and the practices is of a sapling that is strong but that can bend, and it's rooted firmly in the earth. And I think the thing about being given a practice is if you do it, you find out whether it works or not, and by golly, they do. So the main practices are meditation where you tune into the heart, and this whole business of being aware of the breath. And the great thing about Malash is you can do it any time. It's really handy when you realise either a life or I am going a bit doolally, and just to come back to the breath. So I suppose one of the things I've discovered about the practices is that they work. They're very practical. And this lovely business of uniting heaven and earth. So there is no spiritual life, there's just life. I think what has changed, am I answering the question correctly? What's changed over the last
Yeah, well, and just wondering, you are answering it correctly, it's fine, but just, yeah, just how your experience in the tradition is helping you with considering adaptability in these times.
Well, I think the whole point about the practices is they're very specific. You do a particular thing with a particular approach, a particular orientation, but also immensely flexible. So that because we focus on the heart, it was very much a kind of heartfelt response. And I think in our tradition, more and more over the last couple of decades, there's been a focus on really relating to the earth as a living being. And what came through really strongly when something else fell off and I was in a state of shock for a few months was to spend a lot of time in nature. And that's something I've done before, but it suddenly became a daily practice. And being with the breath in nature helped me to process a lot of very difficult feelings, helped my body to physically realign. And there's this sense of this exchange of information and energy between myself and the earth. And I'd done this intermittently before when I needed an extra bit of oomph, like off to Hampstead Heath. But I suppose suddenly there's this sense with the practices, there's nowhere else to go. And I started doing this whole business of being with my breath, with my body in the garden. So somehow the practices helped me to become rooted in my local, exactly where I live, without necessarily consciously being aware of it at the time. So that now Tufnell Park, which is where I lived for 10 years, it really does feel like home now. And I feel like my feet and my soul have become really quite rooted in the land here, the garden and the park, and that's been very powerful. I think the other thing that I guess any spiritual tradition encourages is a certain quality of listening within. And the whole thing of a tradition evolving according to the time, the place, and the people. And there's this wonderful conversation in our community we were having about a year ago about the relationship between our stories and the earth, and giving our stories to the earth. And suddenly, one day I was sitting in the kitchen and this image came up out of the earth. I could see it coming out of the earth. And I thought, wow, that's a story there. So I've started creative writing, and it feels like the practice that has become a practice in itself, and it's something that's very intimately and my own. And so one practice has led to another, and it has felt very much about using the bare bones of what we've been given to bring something to life, a new story. It may never get published, but it's bringing something to life for me. And I do feel like I'm becoming alive in a different way. I could go on and on and on, but I'm just aware that other people want to talk. But that's just a brief outline of what's going on. It feels like something new is stirring and coming alive. And I think also the other thing was suddenly a sense of tremendous urgency. That the world's going crazy. And if I don't plug the holes in my container now, I'm going to sink. And there's suddenly a real urgency about practicing and doing these very simple practices and weaving them into daily life. And it's not that I hadn't done it before, but just to ramp it up somehow. So that this need to be ready for anything.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, David. Thanks for sharing your insight on that. I really appreciate it. Thank you. Okay, so Rhiannon, I'll move on to you with your question, if that's okay. So Rhiannon, as an interfaith minister, I assume, I don't know, but I assume your perspective on faith is quite broad. Does this help you to see the commonality in all faith traditions, I'm wondering? And I wondered if you could tell us a bit more about your perspective of this.
So I think what I'm going to do before I start talking about that is I'm going to switch my video off in the hope that that improves the audio.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Rhiannon.
So yes, I was pondering that question, and actually, because it reminded me of when I started my training, I went with the assumption that what I was doing is I'm going to discover how everything is really all the same, if you go to it. And, and to a certain extent, I still have a beautiful image of, we had speakers from the different faith traditions during the training. And we had this lovely man who was a Hindu, who was talking about his religion. And what he said is he had this lovely image of like a candle in the middle. And he said, because we were sitting round a candle in a circle, and he said, well, if it's like all these lines are going to the middle, going to the center, and depending on where you stand, you have a different view on it. And that can be even within the same faith tradition. Like you can be between two people, they have still a slightly different view on that. So I think a lot of it, yes, the commonality, but for me, actually, when something clicked during my training was the moment when I realized that, no, actually it is about the differences. It is about really seeing how each tradition has its own power, has its own tradition and its own practices. And yes, we can go there ultimately that the intention is the same and the light in the center is still the same, but actually to say it's not all the same, it's actually different. And what it is about is how can we then relate with each other? Can I say, yes, your religion or your perspective on something is different than mine? And what can we learn from each other? Rather than mixing it all together in a way, for me, and that's such a lesson, or that was such a lesson for me. And because I can see that because it applies in different bits. For me, it's about, who are we all individually? And I am who I am, and who are you? To be curious about the other and to find the commonality, but to be open. And I think in these times with all the challenges that we're facing, that is even more important. Because for me, the listening to each other and learning about how we do things differently is really important. And the other thing, because that's, I've been thinking about this, how it's connecting to resilience. I think there is something about a lot of people losing faith or saying, oh, they don't believe in anything. And that's actually where I get really interested, because actually that's where I see is my field of work, because I believe, well, I think everybody carries their own wisdom in them. And my work is to create a space where people can connect to that. So I quite happily work with people from all traditions as well, because I never, if I'm working with a Christian, then I would encourage them to move into their, more into their tradition, if that feels right, or, if they get the urge to do that. And if it isn't, then let's see what's there, what is actually what each of us connects to. And I think that's all I want to say right now.
Yeah, I'm really glad I asked you that question, because I think, it's sort of illuminated for me that I think it's quite easy to have a perception of someone being an interfaith minister that you're always just looking at the commonality. But what I really hear is valuing the difference, valuing the different perspectives. So I'm really glad I asked you the question. I think that's really, yeah, it's really illuminating, actually. Thank you.
Yeah, it was a good question for me as well, because it just sort of, I was reminded of that. So thank you.
Yeah, no, you're welcome. Thank you. Great. Okay, so we'll get into a bit more of the sort of community resilience type questions. So I'm kind of, yeah, I mean, we've already touched on this a little bit. So I'm wondering now, like personally, how you're living resilience, because we've all had to change, we've all had to adapt massively in the last year, and it is now a year this has been happening. I think a year this next week, I think our first lockdown started, so it's now been a year. So how are you living resilience personally? What's personally kind of stepped up for you in the last year? Open to any of you? Anyone feels they want to answer? And we are going to allow moments of pause for reflection as well. So if you don't hear anything for a few seconds, just trust that we're just having a moment of reflection. David, did you want to say? You look like you were about to say, oh, you're muted, David. Sorry.
I just think it's, you know, we're all sitting in silence, and so I'll step forward and say something. I don't quite know what I'm going to say. So how am I living resilience? Gosh, it's a mixture of community and solitude, and most of it is solitude. So I feel suddenly my job, which is a very social and face-to-face job, lots of interaction with people, has been taken away. And I feel like I've been just flung in this cauldron. Every time I try to get out, someone whacks me back in with a wooden spoon. So a lot of it is being oh gosh, it's all about connection, and sometimes just being alone with myself, and it's very hard to get away from, and having to find ways of dealing with whatever comes to the surface when the distractions are stripped away. But it's also about reaching out and connecting to community, which I feel is incredibly important. So, for example, participating in this project is really good fun, and it's the sense of just being pulled out of my tiny little psychic soup world, and being able to give something that's creative and spontaneous is really exciting. And I stopped going to meditation meetings for quite a while. I just felt I needed to stand on my own 2 feet, and suddenly we went into lockdown. They've become very important. So I was attending one meeting a week. I've just started attending a second, and the second one is very small and informal, and I love that sense of community that comes out of it. I'm really struck by what's already been said by Rhiannon about commonality and also difference, because there's the sense through the tradition I'm involved in of something exciting comes to life when I become aware that the earth is alive, and connecting with other people who have that belief and that understanding means that something new is possible. And that something new being possible gives me a sense of excitement that takes me away from the negative narratives you get in the media. And that brings me to the next thing, which is I'm very careful about how much I listen to the radio. It's like not only tuning in carefully inwardly, so it's choosing love over fear, but it's also choosing which version of life out there that I connect with. And making that choice on a daily basis. And then I suppose the other thing is really prioritizing the friendships that matter. I have days when I'm on my own a lot, but there are just a few friendships that really do make a difference, and to really nurture those, I think, is really important.
Yeah, great. Yeah, I think that's something that has been a value of this time, is stripping us down to what's really important.
Yeah.
Yeah, and making us aware of what's really important when a lot of what we were doing falls away. So I think that's been a gift of this time for sure. So yeah, thanks for mentioning that, David. Dilly or Rhiannon, do you feel happy to respond to this question about how you're resilient and adapting? Yeah, Rhiannon.
Yes, so I think at the beginning of the lockdown, I was incredibly, for the first one, I was really frustrated because I just sort of worked out 2 workshops that I wanted to run. And because I just work with people, I need to have people in the room to see and to feel what's going on, because I work quite intuitively a lot of the time. I mean, it's all prepared and there is a schedule, but it needs adapting to who's there. And also because a lot of my work is with the voice, I need people in the room to hear that, or because it works better. Do you know, if you sing together, there's all these bits which you can't do on Zoom. So that was a real challenge, and I got really cross. And I love being with people, and to suddenly not to have that was a real challenge. Having said that, I know how very privileged I am by living in an intentional community. So there is about, I'm not quite sure what the current count is, around 40 adults here in a widespread, you know, it's a space with different, where we all live in our own unities, in our units, self-contained units, as families or individualists. So I was still seeing people both on Zoom, because all the meetings suddenly went on Zoom, and you know, as I'm walking around doing things daily, I see people and I can talk to them, and that feels like an enormous privilege. Also, because I live in the country, I could go out and I could still be there, and yet it's been incredibly difficult. And I think the learning that I've done over this year is to really be with my practice, sort of echoing David in that, you know, my own practice, also opening up to the possibility of, yes, I can connect with people via Zoom. I can even do some of my work online. So that's been a real learning, and there's been a gift in sitting in workshops, you know, led by other people as well, where I felt I could really connect with people on the other end of the world, and really connect with them, even though the only connection we had is on the screen. So that's been a real gift, you know, for me, a learning to open up to that gift. And yet the important thing is, if I do my own practice, it helps me. It helps me stay connected with myself, with the sacred, and actually also with other people. One of the beautiful things I was doing last month here at the community together with a friend, we led a week of gratitude for the land. And so we had, for the whole week, we had different activities that were going on, that people in the main were going out to do on their own, on the land. And that was really powerful for everybody, you know, for all the ones that participated, because we felt so connected, because we were doing the same thing. We were connecting to our land, and people were writing poems or creating artwork. I did a Zoom call on one of my other passions is storytelling, and that was really beautiful. So again, it's this challenge of how can I connect to myself, and how can I then offer to other people ways of connecting to, as I like to phrase it, all that is, and that's the seen and the unseen. Yep, I think that's all I want to say right now. Thank you.
Thanks, Rhiannon. You just reminded me that we had someone else from your community on a conversation a couple of weeks ago, Ruth Sutcliffe.
Yeah, I was doing it with Ruth, and I were doing it. We're doing it.
Yeah, and she was telling us about writing love letters
Yeah.
to the trees on Valentine's Day, and I just loved that. Just loved hearing that. Just reminding me of that. So yeah, adorable. Love that. Thanks, Rhiannon. Dilly, do you feel like sharing anything around how you've had to adapt or be a bit more resilient in the last year? She looks perplexed for anyone who's listening.
Full connection. I didn't hear the last minute at least.
Oh, didn't you? Sorry, you cut out. Okay, that's why you look perplexed. So, yeah, I was just wondering if you had anything to offer to that, how you've had to kind of adapt and be more resilient in the last year, personally.
Well, it's interesting listening to the other speakers, because I feel I have discovered that I'm not very resilient, actually. It's interesting, isn't it? I actually, the sad person that I am, looked up the word resilience before this talk, and it talks about, the thing I was reading was talking about the 7 marks of resilience, and 3 of them were adaptable, optimistic, and ability to show self-compassion. And I was thinking about that, and I'm not really practicing any of that. And I'm very conscious over the last year that all those kind of physical symptoms of trauma that one experiences through prolonged stress, I have gone through in a way, you know, sleeplessness and constantly tense, heart palpitations, not able to really focus or motivate myself, do a lot of crying. So the assumption in the question is that I'm practicing resilience, but I'm not sure I am. I'm trying to practice those things which have served me well in the past, like meditation or gratitude exercises at the end of the day, or the examen from the Christian tradition. But I still feel that there is a chasm, really, between my practices and who I find myself fundamentally to be at this time. I feel I've got a long way to go yet, and I still feel pretty wobbly. And it was a year ago when I was sat in the pub after the Sunday service with some friends, and we were thinking about what we might do for Lent. And somebody said, you know, what I really feel I need is, I want a course on how to help me practice being the sort of person I want to be when the crisis comes. And that pushed us into looking at, we were talking about climate catastrophe, and that pushed us into a series of Lent groups looking at Joanna Macy's work, Active Hope. I don't know if you've come across it, but it's really interesting. But we only got to week 3, and then a different crisis hit, and we were closed down, and the pandemic was on us. And I sort of felt, oh goodness, I haven't got to the end of the book yet. We can't have this pandemic. I don't know how to be resilient yet.
Oh, I think we might have lost you, Dilly.
Yeah.
Oh, I think we lost you just a little bit there at the end. Sorry.
That might have been divine.
The last thing I heard was I haven't learned how to be resilient yet. That was the last thing I heard.
Well, you know, I sort of felt almost cheated. I thought, oh, look, I haven't got to grips with this yet. And I almost feel like for the year I've been struggling to learn for myself what it means to be resilient in a time of real crisis. Yeah, that's probably all I have to say at the moment.
I really appreciate your honesty. Thank you for saying that, because I know that in much of this conversation we're kind of speaking to the part of us that is feeling resilient, and trying to kind of feed that in these conversations. But I really appreciate your honesty in saying, actually, I'm not doing very well at that. I feel, I mean, in what I'm hearing, actually, there is an intention towards resilience, and I think that's great. And I think sometimes when we just get the fact that we're not being resilient illuminated, that can be a big part of the journey, actually, just having that moment to kind of stop and go, actually, I'm not doing so well at that. That allows us to know that what we need to work on, I guess. So thanks for sharing that. I appreciate your honesty. Thank you. So the other question I had, oh yes, Rhiannon, yeah, go for it.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, because for me that's true as well, Dilly, apart from the fact that I too looked up today, what actually does resilience mean? And I think, because I was struggling for most of this year, I have been struggling, but it felt, you know, for me, the difference actually accepting that, to say, I am struggling. I'm not sure how resilient I am, because it's bringing up lots of stuff for me. And to honor that, and then, you know, to look at, you know, what is it? You know, what are actually the practices that I've been neglecting while I was slightly somewhere else? So bringing myself back to that. But I really echo that. I just wanted to. You're not alone, Dilly.
Yeah, thanks, Rhiannon. Yeah, I'm really glad that you've both named that. I'm sure we all feel like that sometimes. So yeah, thank you. And I like that you've acknowledged the process of accepting, you know, recognizing and accepting as a way to kind of moving on to the next stage of it. Thank you. David?
No, you really aren't alone, are you, Dilly? Here I am piping up, and I realised that I actually feel quite uncomfortable talking about this topic, because the last year has been a mixture of resilience and a lack of resilience. And I think this year has opened up possibilities, some of which I've seized and some of which I haven't. And I realised that the threshold I still stand on but haven't crossed is about loving certain parts of myself. There's a fear and shame and anger. I've got to the stage where I pray about it every evening. But to actually physically hold myself when I'm feeling afraid that someone's out to get me and I'm on my own. I haven't gone that far yet. So I think the self-compassion thing is something I'm struggling with. I'm constantly aware that being kind to myself is very difficult, which is kind of ironic, because the path I'm involved in is all about the heart. So it's like, in a way, I wouldn't mind it if Berloff carried on for another 6 months. I could perfect all this and then be enlightened, but it doesn't seem to be working out that way. Be back to work in May at this rate.
Yeah, great. I'm just wondering, kind of a bit spontaneously, I really love this has been named, by the way. Thank you all for braving naming this. I mean, and following on from what you said, David, I know that my version of resilience, which has been a different, you know, we've all had our own version of it. Mine has very much been rooting and bedding in self-care, like massively. to quite an nth degree. That's just become, it's gone from being this important to that important. And that's definitely been a big part of my resilient response personally. I'm just wondering how faith plays into this. As we're talking about faith, and we're talking about kind of, you know, flavors of self-acceptance, acknowledging where we're struggling. How does faith come into that, I wonder? Does anyone feel like answering that question? Pausing for reflection.
Well, I could have a go at that.
Mm-hmm.
I have found, I mean, I'm very much in a religious tradition, the Jewish Christian tradition. And I think what that gives me is the language to articulate some of my deepest fears and my wildest longings. And I mean, religion to me is all about metaphor, symbolism, dreaming, colour, imagination, and stories. And in discovering a story to live by, and finding others on a similar journey in community, I discover that there are people around me who share my questions and my fears and my hopes, and I can play with that. I can stretch my thinking. I know that where I can't do it, someone else can, and where I have an idea, somebody else can take that a bit further. And so what faith gives me is a safe context to push my questions hard, I think, and to continue to dream. And that's, to me, is the very best of what a faith community should be about, really. And to name the unnameable as well. I think, you know, for the Jewish Christian tradition, certainly there's that whole prophetic strand, which doesn't flinch from naming the unacceptable. And it means in doing that you can strive towards something better, because you've looked over the abyss, as it were. So for all their limitations, for all the limitations of the Christian faith, I still feel that for me, it gives me a context out of which I can find meaning and a sense of wholeness, if I allow it to rub up against me in a creative way. The problem for me, of course, is that when you are in a position of leadership, there's a lot projected onto you. So that becomes a struggle in itself, I think. And I don't always feel free to be that person that I've just described within the tradition. But as an ideal, I think that's what my faith gives me. I hope that makes sense. I felt I was waffling a bit.
No, it does. It really makes sense. And I can really appreciate that last bit that you just said, particularly around, you know, being in a position of leadership and how there's an ideal around that could be easily projected onto you, that you don't have those sort of human fallibilities. But I'm really grateful to hear that you do, actually. I'm really grateful to hear that you do. Rhiannon, David, do you feel like you've got, my mind's ticking on this one. Okay, yeah, go for it. Yeah, David, do you want to go as your mic's off?
Yes. Is it?
Yep, it is.
Okay, so wow, this is really interesting. I think The tradition I'm involved in, there's this whole thing about beauty. And a lot of people in the tradition who produce beautiful things, a lot of artists. There's no coincidence. So I'm going to ramble a bit. So I was talking earlier about, finding that practices work. And I guess it's a question of taking that to another level. You were talking about self-care. And I guess when I hit a wall, rather than thinking I should just keep on going, just stop and to really welcome the breath into wherever it is that I'm bouncing off, and just to feel what's going on. Because it's wonderful being in nature, and it's wonderful having something to do which I really enjoy. But I think the challenge is to remember that nature is always here, and that my body is nature, and I can sit down and be the what's going on at any time, and I'm allowed to do that. So this whole, I think it's very interesting seeing this collective narrative and how much I've internalized it. So I think an opportunity to go more deeply into the heart and
So
somehow.
Oh, sorry, God, I was just wondering, does your relationship with nature, does that teach you something around faith?
Yeah, it's just all you've got to do is be in nature, and the body, just the breath after a while just regulates itself. It's fascinating. Don't really, it just happens of its own accord. Yeah.
Okay.
So I'm sorry, I'm not. I don't really feel like I'm cheering everyone up and inspiring.
It's just it's an exploration. It's okay. Rhiannon, would you like to add something?
Yes, so unlike the other two, I feel that I'm an interfaith minister who's really a bit intermingled, because you get, interfaith ministers. Some of my friends are practicing Buddhists or practicing Christians, or whatever, their tradition is, while I have a long story of exploring the different traditions. And so I can't say, this is my tradition. And because it is influenced by the way I grew up as a Protestant in Germany, and was quite actively involved as a teenager in my church. Then to study, I trained as a yoga teacher, which had a profound impact on me, because we did a lot of deep study on the Vedic scriptures, which are the basis of Hinduism and with that Buddhism. And then exploring different shamanic traditions. And I think that's probably where I'm most at home. And it doesn't matter. And in a way, it doesn't matter. And when I think about what is important, what is it that helps me, is actually the feeling that I am never alone. However much I might say, oh, I feel so alone and there's nobody there. And actually, I know, I have a deep knowing that I am not alone, and I can go there, and that supports me. And sometimes I feel like I just know that you're there and I can't feel you right now, but that gives me hope. And I believe in miracles because I've seen them happen. And when I go, for me as well, going out, being outside in nature, and I have a special relationship with trees, really brings me into a space where I get a sense of being one with all that is. And that you know, even if that just happens for a split second, and even like over the last year, it feels it hasn't happened that often, it's still, I know it's there, and that gives me strength and resilience. You know, if I want to name it, like, if I want to phrase it like that, and practices of actually sometimes having a dialogue with the divine, asking question and then seeing what comes up, or whether there's signs that help me make sense out of what's going on. When I sometimes think, I look at this world and what I see is painful. You know, what people are going through, what the earth is going through is painful. And yet, you know, I know there is this connection, and it gives me a trust. It gives me a trust in myself, in other people, and hope. And I think hope is a really important thing for me, that it doesn't finish. So, yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Rhiannon. I really related to some things you said there, and I was reflecting and asking you this question, that I think for me, my faith most comes alive in times of despair. I think it's quieter in my life when things are all right and everything's kind of ticking along, but in moments of despair, when things fall apart and I don't understand what's going on, or that's when faith really comes alive for me. I don't know if other people can relate to that, but it's yeah, that's when I remember feeling moments where that's all I really felt like I had. I didn't know anything else. I couldn't make sense of anything else, but I had faith. I feel like there might be some people that can maybe relate to that. I was just wondering, as you touched on there at the end, Rhiannon, about the relationship between hope and faith. And I think most people I'm speaking to around these topics of community resilience at the moment, or resilience and adaptability in the times we're in, we're not just looking at what's happening now, but we're looking about what's coming, or what might be coming, because we don't really know what's coming at the moment. But we're all, you know, most people I speak to anyway are fairly aware that things are changing, the world is changing, life is changing. And I'm wondering how hope and faith maybe are part of that consideration. How does faith play a part in what may be to come for you? Open question.
For me, it's all comes down to coming to terms with my mortality.
Yeah.
I seem to have lost Catherine. Does that matter? Shall I just keep going? I feel that's so fundamental to who I am as a human being, to who we are as human beings. And you're back, welcome back. I was saying, Catherine, that for me, hope is intrinsically linked really with me coming to terms with my mortality, because I am one of these people who think that a lot of what we get up to in life is displacement activity because of our deep anxiety around death. And I think we've seen that played out time and again during this pandemic. It's shown us up for who we are really as a human race, that we kind of believe we're immortal. And that's not in any way to belittle our lives, but it has thrown up for me the need to come to terms with dying and death and mortality, And I know that once I can rest in that and be at peace in that, I know that will be the point at which I will be able to embrace hope in the way I live my life. It sounds a bit crazy to link the two, but I just know from the way that my heart and soul work that the two are inextricably linked. And I know that I will discover more joy and more hope in living when I accept in a profound way that I will die. Sorry, I hope that hasn't suddenly brought the conversation to a completely different level.
Oh, I really agree with you, Dilly. I really, I think if you really accept our mortality, it makes you aware of how precious life is.
Yeah.
It sort of makes the aliveness more alive. I think that's been my experience anyway. So I think it's
yeah, and even down to having, I'm staring at some beautiful flowers on my coffee table here, but it even makes me think about cutting flowers. Why do I do that? Why do I cut flowers and stick them in a pot to watch them die when they would be so much happier not being chopped in the first place? But it's this connection in my soul, I know, of the acceptance of death that is so crucial in me being able to live a hope-filled life, and one that has meaning.
perfect. Really, yeah, lovely. Thank you for saying that. David, anything to add on this?
Yeah, I'd like to echo what Dilly said, which is that if we're living in such uncertain times and we're heading into more uncertain times, then the things that we rely on are being taken away and are going to continue to be taken away. So I think to be able to face what might happen, which could include not living to a normal lifespan, which could include days when we go without hunger, and to somehow get through to a place where you can accept that, so that there's this trust that life goes on. And I think hope now has to be a long-term thing, so that even if my life doesn't go on, and even if we are in the process of destroying so much that is precious, if there is an intention that what we're doing now is for the benefit of generations to come, then even in the darkest times, I think we can have hope. But I think it's going to take enormous courage to face very difficult truths, and not just to face them in our heads, but to really embrace the horror of it and how we feel about it in our hearts. I'm sorry to depress us all, but it's almost like if we can face the darkness, then we can allow the light to come through. Yeah.
Yeah, I totally agree. I don't think we can really honestly look at a resilient future without accepting that. You know, if we're avoiding that reality, how can we really? Yeah, I don't think we can do it. I don't think it's possible. So no, I think it's really relevant. Rhiannon, anything to add to this?
Well, yes, it's interesting. Because I'm thinking now about this, the relationship with death in all of this. And for me, speaking personally, I have a strong sense that I'm not just my body. And that comes from my, from my own practice. And there is more, and I don't know, the end is, I don't know what will happen when I die. Nobody knows really. And I think there will be something, but I'm open to the possibility that there is nothing. And yet I have a strong sense of I'm not afraid to die. She says, at this moment, we'll see what happens if life presents me with an interesting situation. But there is a bit where I think, though, that it's important, but because I feel that I have a connection, you know, I have a sense of I'm not just my body. That is something that I experience when I work with people as well, to the question, how can I open up this possibility for other people? You know, a sense of that there is more than, and it's also about there is more than I am. So when I'm out, like for me, when I'm out, I'm standing with a tree and I can really breathe in, and I'm having a sense that I'm connected to everything. And that then makes my own, who I am, I can see in a different, I can look at in a different way. I don't know whether that makes any sense, but and you know, it sounds like I've got it all sorted out, and I haven't. You know, I have moments of doubts, and I have moments where I lose the connection, but the possibility, you know, the knowing that there is a possibility of that. And I see a lot of people who've like lost all faith, or that's what they tell me, and they're longing for a connection to something. And I said that, I think, in my introduction, that's where I find it really exciting to create spaces where people can connect with themselves and discover for themselves what it is that gives meaning to their lives, or that gives meaning to that what connects all of it. And that, again, and that's why I think that's so important at this moment in time, to go on a level that is not just the material and the body, and it's important to acknowledge these things as well, and to see these, and then, you know, is there a way of how we can deepen into being where there is a space to be in a different way and respond in a different way to the crisis. The crises that are there and that might come or not. And even it goes even though for the moments of beauty, because I can embrace moments of beauty so much more when I come from that place.
Yeah, thanks, Rhiannon. Nice point to end on. So I think I'm going to move to our last question, because it's gone very quickly. We're nearing the end. And it's been a really interesting conversation. I think just one question I'd like to finish on, which I have always finished these conversations on, is what you are really seeing, or what's really standing out to you in life at the moment as a particular challenge that we're facing, and what do you feel moved to as a response to that? Pausing for reflection. David?
I think one of the challenges is, if we come back to our friend faith, is this is something that we all have. It's not just religious faith, I think, as you said at the beginning. And that the challenges that humanity faces now are universal, they affect everyone. And therefore we need a language that we can all speak. So I get frustrated with spiritual language because it implies that this is spiritual and that isn't. In the word spiritual, it's one of those annoying words. It's almost impossible not to use. So I think one of the challenges is to find a way of relating that includes everyone. And that's partly, I think, reframing the way we use language. So when I'm writing, I'm very consciously aware that I don't want to use spiritual language. But it also, I think it includes speaking across the divide. So we've had the whole, you know, pro or anti-Brexit, or pro or anti-Trump, and now it's pro or anti-vax. And how can we include people that we might very strongly disagree with? So there's a sense of communicating and communing in a way that brings everyone together, because I think there are forces that want to drive us apart. And that really concerns me.
Sorry, David,
And I think it's possible.
last sentence or so,
I think it's possible.
Sorry. You think it's possible? Yeah, okay.
I think it's possible. I think it's possible.
Yeah. Really good point to name. Thank you. Thank you. DILLY or RHIANNON?
Well, I guess for me, Catherine, it would be building on what David's just said, really. It's I mean, it's been said a lot, I know, but it's about drawing a different map, really, not returning to what's constantly defined as business as usual. We've seen, haven't we, during the pandemic, we've understood a bit more the real value of so many people whose lives were hidden from us before. And are we going to affirm their value going forward? People have been undervalued, and I think that's really crucial going forward. And then there was that tweet going around, wasn't there, early on in the pandemic, which said something about Mother Earth has shut her recalcitrant child into the bedroom until she has decided to behave and can be let out again. And the earth was beginning to breathe, and because Mother Earth needed to take a few breaths and get away from the child who was having a major tantrum. And we've seen that. We know that it's a great image, isn't it? It stayed with me, and we've all seen the earth beginning to breathe again, and we have wondered at that and been amazed by that and warmed to that, and how fragile that is, and how that could all so easily be lost again. And my hope would be that we can again rewrite the map and put our pleasure in the earth at the center of it, and our relationship with and our love for, so that, and our spirituality and our religions have to change their language in order to adapt to what we know about the earth now and our relationship with it. So we can't use the old stories and the old language anymore. We've got to shift quickly if we're going to find a new future, I think. But that's exciting. It's a huge challenge, but it's exciting. So I'll sign up for that.
Yeah, me too. I'll sign up for that too. I think there's something we touched on in the last conversation, is that some people are feeling excited about what's going on, in that it means something new is possible. And I definitely, yeah, I'm definitely feeling connected with that. Yeah, because thank God we need something different. Right? We need something different, and we weren't going to stop on of our own accord. So, you know, life has intervened and given us an opportunity, and I'm grateful for that. Thank you. Rhiannon?
Yeah, interesting. What I'm sitting with right now, I think is, I'm reflecting what David said about this word spiritual and spirituality. And yes, it is a word that is words are so difficult. I mean, you know, I have a background as a linguist, and I love looking at the power of words, and spiritual is an interesting word because people use it in so many different ways. I've started using more the sacred, and I'm being very careful with that as well, because I'm thinking, well, if people say that too often, then again we have the bit, you know, the different bits where people use it because they all think they mean the same and they don't. And I think even more during this pandemic, what's become clear for me is that I actually need to use this language more and be maybe more precise about what I mean with it. But I have a real sense of it's important to name the sacred, to name the other dimension to life. And I find that hugely exciting, really. And for me, you know, because I'm not saying, you know, this is for everybody, but this is just really, it's very personal for me, that it's time for me, it feels, to speak up for connection. I think connection to all that is. And when I think about what do I see as the real challenge, I see as the real challenge how disconnected people often are, and this pandemic has led for me to a lot of disconnection that I've seen and noticed, and a way of really finding ways to listen to each other, listening to each other, and listening to each other though with the sense that something else is possible, and let's find out together what this something else is. And it can be that we all have slightly different ways, like, you know, coming back to this image of the candle in the middle and all the different paths, allowing the different paths, and yet, you know, we're going towards one light. That's my hope.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Rhiannon. Thank you. I feel I'm left with lots of kind of things to ponder, I think, from our conversations, things that have kind of got me thinking in different ways, and I hope for anyone watching or listening to this, I hope it's doing the same. I'm really grateful for your honesty and for sharing, you know, the bits that aren't feeling resilient too. I'm really grateful that you shared that. So thanks for sharing your wisdom and your struggles as well, because we're all human and we have that in common too. So so thanks to all of you. Yeah, thank you. I feel like I've got lots to think about from our conversation, so thank you. So just to mention, next week we're going to be doing a session. It's going to be a little bit different. It's going to be sacred sound. So we're looking at how sacred sound is a way into resilience, and how sacred sound particularly is a way to stay connected and stay resilient in these times. So we've got some lovely things happening in that session. We're going to have a start with a gong bath. We've got some beautiful musicians sharing their heartfelt, soulful music with us. So I'm really looking forward to that session. So if you want to just come and listen and lay in the balm of it, I'm sure it will be a nice experience. If you want to follow us on Facebook, it's Community Resilience Live Talks. It's the same name on YouTube. And if you're listening on the podcast, we're also on Spotify, Apple Music and Google Podcasts, all under the name of Community Resilience Live Talks. Thanks. thank you very much for being part of this, and wishing you all well with your ongoing journeys and questions around all the things we discussed today. Thank you all, and wishing you well.
Thank you, Catherine.
Really welcome.
Thank you
Thanks,
very much,
Catherine.
Catherine.
Thank you.
You were a great host.
Thank you. I'm learning, Dilly. I'm working it out. Okay, take care,
Thank you,
everyone.
Catherine.
Thanks.
you.
Bye.
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 Community.